2 beavers were placed in a zinc-lined crate and rowed out into the Adirondacks. That is not a metaphor. In 1904, a wildlife conservationist purchased 7 Canadian beavers from a closing World's Fair exhibit, loaded them onto a train, and had workers physically row them into the South Fork of the Moose River using a wooden boat and a crate sealed with zinc. The entire operation was funded by a $500 state legislative appropriation. The establishment wildlife community gave it no serious chance of working. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what happened in the 80 years that followed, and it will permanently change how you calculate the relationship between scale, cost, and ecological power. But there is one detail buried in the 1915 survey data that no one in the conservation literature has ever fully explained. The numbers did not just exceed expectations, they shattered the theoretical ceiling of what a closed founder population was biologically capable of producing, and the implication of that anomaly reaches far beyond the Adirondacks. In 1671, a single Dutch shipping season delivered 80,000 beaver pelts to European markets. The number requires a moment of stillness. 80,000 animals harvested and processed in a single commercial cycle flowing out of one watershed. The Hudson Valley traders who organized that season did not see an ecosystem. They saw a balance sheet, and the balance sheet was extraordinary. What they were liquidating, though they had no framework to understand it, was not merely a wildlife population. They were dismantling the continent's primary water management infrastructure. For 10,000 years before that first Dutch ship arrived, an estimated 100,000 beavers had occupied what is now Adirondack Park, roughly 9 animals per square mile across a territory the size of Vermont. The conservationist Harry Radford, writing in 1907, described the original landscape as one where every lake and pond was occupied, where every river, brook, and tributary, from the largest to the most insignificant, was maintained by these animals, generation by generation, dam by dam. The Adirondacks were not a forest with ponds in it. They were a wetland archipelago built and sustained by a single keystone species. The collapse was methodical and total. The European felt hat market, having discovered that beaver underfur treated with mercury produced the finest felt in the world, created a demand that was, in practice, unlimited. By 1895, the New York State zoologist conducting the first formal wildlife census of the region filed a report that read as an obituary. Fewer than 10 individual beavers survived inside the entire Adirondack region, one family colony holding on near Saranac Lake Inn, representing the last biological remnant of a population that had once shaped the hydrology of the northeastern continent. The official scientific consensus at the time was that recovery at any meaningful scale was not realistic. The genetic bottleneck was too severe. The habitat degradation was too advanced. The budget available to the state conservation effort, $500, was, by any institutional standard, laughable. And then, in 1915, the first decade of survey data came in. What the census teams found in those forests did not match any projection the establishment had produced. The population metrics were not merely encouraging. They represented something the existing models had no category for. Think about that number one more time, 34 founding animals, and what the data said had happened to them in 10 years. The number that matters is not 80,000. The number that matters is 10. Because by 1895, after 2.5 centuries of continuous commercial extraction, after the Dutch shipping routes, after the English colonial expansion, after the American fur trade pushed west and then circled back, the New York State zoologist James Tanner completed the first official census of beaver populations across the Adirondack region and recorded fewer than 10 surviving individuals. One colony. One family group, holding a single stretch of water near Saranac Lake Inn, in roughly 6,000 square miles of territory that had once sustained 100,000 of them. That is not a collapse, that is an erasure. What made the 1895 finding genuinely extraordinary, and what the official conservation literature consistently underweights, is that this was not merely a wildlife population at the edge of extinction. It It was the structural failure of a hydrological system that had been actively engineered for 10 millennia. Every marsh, every kettle pond, every braided tributary visible on a modern Adirondack survey map exists because beavers built it. The water grid was not a backdrop. It was a product, and by 1895, the engineers were gone. Auditing an environmental mismatch of this scale requires stabilizing our geographic coordinate field. Go ahead and enter your state, province, or territory in the comments section below, noting specifically if your local woodlands or river valleys are currently exhibiting unexpected canopy loss, severe stream erosion, or accelerating thermal stress. If you want this hidden data map to reach more analytical minds, hit the share button right now to push this investigation through the algorithmic noise. Let's return directly to the timber plots, because this species' ancient blueprint was about to be reseeded from a single crate. And what happened to that crate is where the official story breaks down entirely. Now here is what you need to understand about how a continent loses its water. The fur trade's economics were not complicated. European hatters had discovered in the early 1600s that beaver underfur, when treated with mercuric nitrate, produced a felt so fine and so durable that no competing material could touch it. A single quality hat was selling for over £4 by 1663, several months of wages for an ordinary craftsman, and the appetite across Paris, Amsterdam, and London was essentially without a ceiling. The beaver did not become commercially extinct in Europe because trappers were careless. It became extinct because the demand was structural. When the European population collapsed, the market simply redirected west, and the North American continent absorbed the pressure that had hollowed out an entire hemisphere before it. There is a dark footnote here that the standard conservation history treats as a curiosity, but which is actually a diagnostic detail. The hatters processing this fur were being poisoned. Mercury vapor, inhaled daily across years of production, attacks the nervous system, tremors, memory loss, behavioral collapse, which is where the phrase, "mad as a hatter," originates. The industry that was dismantling North America's hydrology was simultaneously destroying the neurological function of its own workforce. The supply chain was toxic at both ends. By 1901, the state of New York had appropriated $500 to address what remained of this catastrophe. Not 500,000, not 500 million. $500, the cost, at the time, of a modest horse and carriage, to attempt the ecological reconstruction of 6,000 square miles. The man responsible for deploying that budget was a conservationist named William Nye, and his solution was, by any conventional measure, absurd. In 1904, a wildlife exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair was closing. 7 live Canadian beavers, held in a display enclosure, were available for purchase. Nye acquired them, loaded them onto a rail car, transporting them across state lines, and had workers physically row them in a zinc-lined wooden crate into the South Fork of the Moose River. Between 1901 and 1907, using acquisitions like this one, Nye's team released a total of 34 founder animals into the Adirondack watershed. 34 animals, 6,000 square miles, $500. Tracking a multi-decade botanical and wildlife crisis requires an audience of analytical minds who value cold, diagnostic tracking data over superficial, emotional conservation stories. If you find yourself aligned with this level of independent investigation, authorize your entry into our research network by hitting that subscribe button right now. If the unvarnished facts we uncover matter to you, drop a quick like to tell the algorithm this raw data sequence deserves more engagement. Now follow the timeline straight into the 10-year population survey logs, because when the tracking data cleared the field, the metrics completely weaponized the project's authority. Because in 1915, the census teams went back into those forests, and the numbers they returned with were not an encouraging trend line. They were a rupture in what institutional science believed was physically possible. By 1915, just 10 years after that rowboat trip, the census data came in, and it did not describe a recovery. It described something the establishment had no framework to process. 15,000. Not 1,500. Not 1,500 with a promising growth curve. 15,000 individual beavers descended from 34 founders in a single decade. By 1921, that number had crossed 20,000. By the time the full ecological accounting was completed, the Adirondack population had surpassed 50,000 animals, a 1,470-fold return on a $500 investment. The infrastructure they built in that time was staggering. Individual dam structures stretching 2,000 feet in length, a 9-fold increase in open surface water across the watershed, a 46% increase in plant species richness at the water's edge, a 148% cumulative boost in total system biodiversity as minks, river otters, great blue herons, and wood ducks spontaneously recolonized terrain that had been biologically empty for 2 centuries. Nature did not gradually heal, it detonated. The state wildlife managers who received the 1915 survey did not celebrate. They panicked. By 1924, local property owners were filing formal complaints about flooded fields, and the state legislature moved to reopen regulated trapping seasons, the first direct policy consequence of a recovery that had outrun every projection used to justify the original program. But the population numbers, extraordinary as they were, turned out to be the least significant thing those 34 animals had done. But the real story of what those beavers were doing in the Adirondacks was not the population number. It was what the population was building. In 2021, Dr. Emily Fairfax, a hydrologist at California State University Channel Islands, who had spent years mapping beaver activity against satellite wildfire telemetry, published findings that fundamentally reframed what the Adirondack experiment had actually accomplished. What she and geomorphologist Joe Wheaton had been tracking across the American West was this: during catastrophic megafire events, fires hot enough to incinerate pine canopy, to sterilize topsoil, to collapse entire forest systems, the valleys engineered by beaver populations did not burn. They stayed green, vivid, saturated green, visible from orbit, surrounded on every side by ash. The mechanism, once named, was almost insultingly simple. Beaver dams raise the local water table. Raised water tables saturate the soil and the root systems and the standing vegetation for hundreds of meters in every direction. Saturated material does not ignite. When Fairfax quantified this effect across multiple fire events, the numbers were staggering. Beaver-engineered wetlands absorbed 3 times less wildfire damage than surrounding terrain, retained 9 times more water during peak drought conditions, and the ponded surface area they maintained autonomously sequestered an estimated 470,000 tons of carbon annually across North American beaver ranges. When a hydrologist with years of satellite fire data says that wet sticks do not burn, that is not a metaphor. That is an infrastructure assessment. The Adirondack conservationists in 1904 were not trying to build a continental wildfire defense system. They were trying to save an animal from extinction on a $500 budget. What they accidentally constructed, without engineering plans, without federal appropriation, without a single carbon credit or climate summit, was a self-replicating firebreak network that modern land management agencies are now spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to replicate through industrial intervention. This profound divergence between a species' historical native range and its true evolutionary ecosystem limit is actively throwing global restoration plans into chaos. For those of you tracking this from regions testing assisted plant migration, introduced forestry plots, or localized arboretum boundaries, document your specific growth or land anomalies below. If you believe real-world engineering data like this needs to be shared, take a second to hit that share button to broadcast this file to your own network. Your direct field telemetry keeps our macro mapping accurate. Look closely at the final legal and administrative invoice for this distributed survival matrix. Because the last question this investigation has to answer is the one the data makes unavoidable. If 34 animals, released from a rowboat on a $500 budget, built infrastructure that generates this level of measurable economic and ecological return, what exactly is that infrastructure worth? And what does the answer tell us about every dollar we have spent trying to solve this problem in a different way. The arithmetic is not complicated. 34 animals, $500, one wooden rowboat, and the result was a self-assembling continental defense system that modern governments cannot replicate at any price. Here is the shape of what you have just witnessed. A species that had engineered North America's water grid for 10,000 years was reduced to fewer than 10 individuals by a single market signal, a hat. The recovery cost less than a horse and carriage. The return was 15,000 animals in a decade, 50,000 in a generation, and a wildfire resistance network that absorbs 3 times less fire damage and retains 9 times more water than any terrain humans have managed to protect. The question is no longer whether keystone species reintroduction works. The question is why we are still building reservoirs. If 34 animals in a zinc-lined crate accidentally solved the drought and wildfire crisis that is now consuming billions in emergency federal spending, then we have not been losing a climate battle. We have been refusing to remember who already won it for us. In our next case file, we follow biologists into a river system that industry declared permanently dead, and what they found on sonar in the bottom mud makes everything in this investigation look like a rehearsal. If this evidence changes how you calculate the problem, the subscribe button is there. So is the share function. Use them if the arithmetic moves you. 2 beavers were placed in a zinc-lined crate and rowed out into a dying watershed. We are still living inside what they built.